Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Rent from 2005. And yes, I'm serious. Anytime there's a major musical that's a huge hit and culturally significant, or anytime there's any sort of property that's a huge hit and culturally significant and Hollywood isn't a part of it initially, they of course want a piece of it and want a movie version. And for the most part, Hollywood's fairly good at making a big hit out of an already proven property. But Rent is one of the examples of when Hollywood really bungled it up completely and completely missed the mark. Now, probably because they picked a completely wrong director, they waited probably about like 7 years too long, and that the cast was probably 6 or 7 years too old to even be in a Rent movie at this point. But they went along with it anyway, probably because it was in development for so long and so much money had actually been spent on it already. They wanted to hopefully make a profit off of it, and they actually saw it slightly being made, so they went and did it. Regrettably, this doesn't really get the energy of the songs at all. It's almost filmed like they're filming a stage production. It's poorly made completely, and it's kind of odd that they'd missed the mark so much on a musical that potentially could have been a bigger hit if it had been made well, or if it had been made a lot earlier. But Hollywood just didn't really know what to do with it, and it came along at a time when Hollywood didn't really know what to do with musicals, and then when it came along at the time when Hollywood slightly understood what to do with musicals, it was really not that much better of an era to be in. So Rent kind of just gets lost in the shuffle of film history, not being able to take advantage of the uniqueness of the musical in the first place. A very unique and diverse group of friends who are living in the Alphabet City area of the East Village in New York City. It mostly centers on two friends, a musician and a filmmaker, who are living in a apartment together, and they have friends one who's a drag queen and a street musician, a stripper, a performance artist, and a philosophy professor, who are all living together and not being able to actually pay rent, which they sing a lot about at the beginning. That's not a joke. They really sing a song about rent and then say the word rent like a million times. It's about a year from 1989 to 1990 as they're trying to find their way and hopefully continue living in New York, and a majority of them living with HIV and trying to stay alive in New York. The thing with Rent, the movie, is that it's really directed by the wrong person, Chris Columbus, of Home Alone, Pixels, Mrs. Doubtfire, and the first two Harry Potters fame. And this is kind of really the turning point in his career, when he's not making films that probably you'd ever see again because they suck. This is actually his first film he made after doing the first two Harry Potter films. And it feels very much his direction on the first two Harry Potter films, where he's a very Hollywood director. You can tell he's a Hollywood studio director, and those were a lot more common in the 90s and early 2000s, but they really didn't make their way after that. That's not really as common and not as celebrated as someone like Chris Columbus could be when he was huge in Chris Columbus. And he kind of extended his welcome with the Harry Potter films and being this huge filmmaker. I mean, he had a ton of big hits, so I assume if Chris Columbus wanted to direct Rent, he would get to direct Rent. And there had been many attempts before, particularly by Spike Lee, who's referenced in one of the songs in Rent, but I actually think probably was the best choice, because he honestly probably would have shot it in a much better way and cut it up, and has a better energy that would work well with Rent. He would really understand the grime of Alphabet City, New York at the time, and he obviously knows how to make a New York movie and get that to work. I would like to see a Spike Lee Rent film. That sounds interesting and exciting to me, especially after watching this one. Like, I kept thinking about, like, wow, what would Spike Lee do with this? I'm sure he would have given it a lot more of a frenetic energy and interesting energy that would have matched the music and made it more unique and grimy and dirty, and made it a lot more exciting. They probably would have directed it more like a movie musical, and even Martin Scorsese was offered it. One of the producers of this film was Robert De Niro, and he brought the script to Martin Scorsese, but he didn't think the script was really ready, and it ended up with Chris Columbus. Baz Luhrmann and Sam Mendes were considered, and I wish I'd taken it. But Chris Columbus, honestly, when you hear of everyone who was considered, sounds like the absolute worst choice, but he actually did have some power at the time. I honestly think that's why. But the way he shot it feels more like he's trying to just capture the performances from the musical and not actually try to transport it into a different medium. He's too beholden to the stage production. I don't really understand why Chris Columbus would want to do something like this. I imagine because he had been doing more family-friendly fare and he wanted to do something different. If you look at actually just the poster for the original musical of Rent versus the movie version of Rent, you can tell honestly the problems with this adaptation. It feels like a rock album cover, and this feels like a shitty movie musical where they tried to do the original poster but cleaned it up so you can make out everybody's faces and everything. We don't want this to be too weird. It feels very much like a Hollywood movie musical, and there was no way this wasn't going to be. It was going to have to be a Hollywood musical in a very Hollywood way, but it's almost like emphasizes the Hollywoodness of it too much, and that's really not something that's going to work for Rent. You kind of have to like direct it in a different way, certainly a Hollywood way, but not in a way that calls it to mind so much, and particularly by direction that just feels like an ordinary studio director. Chris Columbus has no voice in this direction at all. He's letting Rent channel through him in such a basic, boring way. It just feels like he just shot it the best way he could with a few cameras. There's not much difference between this movie and just shooting the stage production, which is also like, why even make the fucking movie then? The 2000s, I know musicals would come back, and that's part of the problem this movie getting stuck in development hell, is that musicals were kind of gone throughout most of the 90s. You had like Evita and a few rare exceptions, but you really couldn't get a musical made in the 90s too often. So the idea that a Rent movie wouldn't get made in the 90s is actually understandable, even though I think it probably would have been a much better movie if it had been made then. But I think Hollywood at the time was not ready for that kind of a movie. So then when you get to the point after films like Chicago and Moulin Rouge become big hits, musicals were becoming bigger business. So Hollywood was more open to doing musicals, and since this had been in development for so long and been trying to be made for so long, obviously they were actually going to move forward with it. And I don't think this is a great era in movie musicals, mostly because you don't have directors like Vincent Minnelli, you don't have a Bubsley Berkeley or a Robert Weiss. You don't have directors who are going to make an amazingly epic, beautiful musical movie that just wows you in how technically great it is and the wonder of Hollywood. This is kind of the same problem I also have with kind of 90s romantic comedies trying to recapture classic Hollywood, but not thinking about how like the people who made those films in classic Hollywood were like Billy Wilder and George Cukor, and were like incredible, world-class, amazing directors, and not just regular studio hired hands who do a basic job and then overscore the shit out of it and remove the artistry completely and make it kind of a corporate shill of classic Hollywood. The movie musicals that happen in the 2000s are very much in the same way. They're so removed from it, it's almost like they're trying to channel it, but they almost know nothing about it other than like books and stills. It's almost like all those old musicals are lost and they're just trying to remember them, and they're doing it poorly through the guise of watching them 40 years ago. And Rent really feels like that, and Rent shouldn't feel like that. Rent should feel young and vibrant and fun, and it like doesn't. It's all made on a studio. They didn't shoot it in New York, which is surprising because Chris Columbus made one of the greatest New York movies, Home Alone 2, right? But you'd think he'd understand to shoot a New York movie in New York. I think they shot a lot of it in California on sound stages and stuff, and it feels that way. And Rent doesn't feel like a movie that should be shot that way. And I know apparently Spike Lee did try to find New York locations that would work for it and was having trouble because the New York of 1989 was not the New York of the early 2000s whatsoever. So trying to do that in New York was probably slightly impossible. Most of the cast was in the original production, except for Rosario Dawson and Tracy Toms, mostly because one of the cast members actually said she thought she was too old to do it anymore, which I kind of agree with because, I mean, I think they're all actually really good actors. Some of the actors in this film are a little off because they feel like they're more stage actors than film actors, although some of them it translates very well. Jesse L. Martin does a pretty good job. I also like Anthony Rapp. I think they do a decent enough job with the material, but it's pretty clear they're not 19 or 20. I don't really know why they didn't recast it. There is a lot of fans of Rent. They're called Rent heads, and I think maybe they were trying to appeal to them, but like making a good Rent movie probably would have appealed to them too. So I don't really think they should have done it. Like if they're going to do this film, should have been made in 97, 98. Past 2000, this movie shouldn't have happened, and it happened anyway because they could get everyone back, and it was such a big deal, and it won all these awards, and that's cool. But I don't think it really did the movie any favors. It was already badly shot. It was already being made in a way that was inappropriate, and then you have a cast that half works and half doesn't. Wilson Germain Herdia, who won awards for his performance as Angel in the original Rent musical, like on stage, didn't really translate that well. In fact, I actually thought he was a new cast member because he was like really bad in the movie. Like I was like, this was a big deal performance. Same with Idina Menzel, really felt out of place. It's not because what I know of her now, it's just like it didn't feel like a real genuine performance. Taye Diggs is not in this movie very much. He gets top billing because he's Taye Diggs. Some people who are good at stage acting are not good film actors, or vice versa. It just kind of works out that way. And the music felt like I was listening to an alternative album in the 90s. I like a lot of the music. Since I'm not familiar with the musical that much and I haven't heard the whole soundtrack before, that was probably the best part of it. How you direct and film a movie musical is like really important. It's not just something you just kind of do at a whim. And that's kind of the problem with the 2000s movies, is they just don't feel like they have the professionalism and the amazingness that the films from classic Hollywood did, and Rent is very guilty of that. Certainly like something like Seven Brides for Seven Brothers didn't do a lot of cutting, but they got it to work for itself. Rent isn't that way. Rent should have a lot of edits in it. Rent should get it to work. And there's certain things about Rent that it works certainly for the stage, but like the character of Mark Anthony Rapp, who's like a filmmaker, what is he making? He's making this weird montage movie or something. He's just filming things. It looks like he's making an experimental film that people make in Hollywood movies, not an actual experimental film. I liked the kind of alternative music that was coming through the movie. It was clearly current at the time. It's the kind of thing that really should have been made quickly. They shouldn't have sat on it as long as they did. And I think in the 90s it probably would have done a lot better. This film was like $40 million. It did not make its money back like whatsoever, and was kind of a flop, and continued Chris Columbus. Like I think he made a Percy Jackson movie, and then of course he made Pixels. Maybe in 20 years or 10 years someone will go back and make the Rent movie that should have happened, because Rent is actually a really big deal. It's one of the longest running shows on Broadway. It's got a hell of a good score, and it's not a bad musical. It's just this is a bad movie. And there's certain musicals that are like highly regarded and are really great, and then I see the movie and I'm like, the songs are great, but the way they film this is garbage. And this is probably one of the worst ones. This is up there with like the Annie movie that came out last year. They didn't really know how to make the Rent movie that should have happened. It almost feels like it's so different from the regular kind of musical and so new that you really needed an original auteur director. And like a Scorsese, who did a musical with New York, New York, or Spike Lee, who's done a lot of great things with music. Look at the beginning of Do the Right Thing. Could have captured that, and even captured it on a set a lot better than Chris Columbus had, because also they both know, I know they both know who Vincent Minnelli is. And Chris Columbus, I got the impression, maybe saw this on Broadway once. There's no love of movie musical. And the thing about movie musical is it's a real love of Hollywood and movie making. It's not just like, hey, this is a Hollywood production, blandly and blankly isn't gonna work for this. And that's kind of why this movie fails. There needed to be a strong voice behind it. There needed to be someone who cared about making a Rent movie, and there just wasn't. There's so much wrong with this adaptation. It's kind of like how people say in a classic movie, all the right things came together. This is one of those where all the worst intentions happened and they made kind of a mess of a movie, which really is a slog to get through. The pacing in this is awful. I know there are other problems with it, but I don't know the musical outside of this movie, so I can't really talk about those things. But as a movie, you can tell this just didn't work because of a variety of stupid artistic theories that weren't really theories. They were just trying to capture something that they completely failed at capturing by kind of taking a step back. But by taking a step back, what they did is they completely missed it, and we got a subpar Rent movie. This is the kind of movie that makes you go, hey, someone should make a better Rent movie. So if you have seen Rent and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. So I reviewed Rent. I guess this video honestly is dedicated to Nolan, who's been wanting me to review Rent forever for whatever reason. I do not understand the fascination with this movie, but whatever. So I guess you guys don't have to comment, please review Rent anymore, because I've done it. So there you go. I just kind of wanted to do it. I wanted to say I'd done it, I guess, because it became such a thing. So it was kind of fun that it was a thing, but I guess now it's over. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, is all reference from the Pizza Party podcast, and that's why I'm making this. And yeah, but to everyone else, I hope you enjoyed this review. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.